Good morning, everybody. My name is Gabriel Motzkin. בוקר טוב לכולם. ברשותכם אני אעבור לשפה האנגלית, מה שכבר עשיתי, בגלל האורחים. My name is Gabriel Motzkin. I'm the director of the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, and it is both my particular pleasure and my honor to open this conference, which is in some ways the annual conference of our project on Christian subjectivity. We find that this group has been one of the innovative groups in our conspectus of activities, and we congratulate the group and its leader, Dr. Christoph Schmidt and Dr. Merav Mak, on producing this very fascinating conference. Now, before I get to the speakers, I want to say one thing about evil, which is, as you know, in the tradition, evil can be seen either as deprivation or as negativity or as a positive force. And I would like you to think that when you think of the questions of taboo and secularization, you should think about whether what is being secularized is the deprivation or the negativity or the actual positive force, because these give different models of what is left and what is not left, and the same is true for the taboo. And without more ado, I would like to present to you our keynote speaker, Professor William Desmond, who is Professor of Philosophy at the Institute of Philosophy at the Catholic University of Leuven. I will not proceed to pronounce it in Dutch or Flemish. And he's also the David Cook Visiting Chair in Philosophy at Villanova. Now, he's written lots and lots of books already. His famous book, which had a lot of impact, called Being in the Between, but then Ethics in the Between, Hegel's God, Art, Origins, Otherness, Between Philosophy and Art, Is There a Sabbath for Thought, The Intimate Strangers of Being, and on and on. And so he will speak to us on Endorsing the Serpent, on Hegel's sin. And without more ado, Professor Desmond.
Thank you very much. First of all, I want to thank Professor Christoph Schmidt for inviting me here and organizing this seminar, and also to Professor Motzkin for his welcome. And also I want to thank Dr. Merav Mak for her marvelous work in doing all the practical things in making this possible. Many things could be said about evil, many things could be said about Hegel and evil. I've written quite a bit on Hegel's understanding of evil, so I confine myself to a few things here today. I have an opening section which just briefly introduces some of the things I want to say. I'll give a short exposition of Hegel, and then I'll bring in a sense of evil which I don't think fits into the Hegelian way of thinking, but that raises, I think, fundamental questions. So I'll read and keep my eye on the time from the point of view of remaining within bounds, and if necessary, extemporize in terms of what I've written here. So to read, Stanley Cavell says somewhere, philosophy cannot say sin. Among philosophers, he is not alone in saying this. One thinks of Nietzsche, for instance. There are many passages in Nietzsche where he wants simply to get rid of the concept of sin entirely. Or Heidegger in Being and Time, when he says that, quoting, philosophical questions essentially know nothing of sin. So why is it so that philosophy cannot say sin? Is there a possibility for philosophy to bring us round to sin again? One might even ask if it is part of the sin of philosophy that it cannot say sin. Something of the relationship of philosophy and religion is here at stake. When philosophy thinks of itself entirely as a matter of self-determining rational thought, it is inclined to separate itself from religion and its outlooks, as putatively a realm of dubious, if not contaminating, heteronomy. Sin belongs to that realm of contaminating heteronomy. So even supposing philosophy cannot say sin, can it say evil? I'd like to take Hegel as a case study here. He does talk about evil, and I will look at some of the details, but the sense of sin does not figure in a strong sense. I take this to be connected to a strong rationalization of evil and a speculative diminution of the significance of the personal God. The effect of certain rationalizations may go with an acknowledgement of evil in a variety of forms, but it may well have the effect of weakening the sense of sin. Hegel's philosophy is a dialectical endorsement of the serpent. A question I want to raise is whether there is a transmoral sense of evil, which is more properly said of sin, a sense of evil in which a logic of self-determination reaches certain boundaries where both good and evil cannot be approached in terms simply of our moral self-determination. So if there is this transmoral sense, it is not ethical in Hegel's sense, but rather crosses the boundary between the ethical and the religious. As having crossed that boundary, does it restore us to a sense of sin, where the intimate relation of the human and the divine is also restored to its centrality? And one could also ask if philosophy has anything to say about this sense of evil. So I just, again, as an opening set of remarks, note this contrast. The notion of sin suggests something of a transgression against the divine source, a refusal or a revolt, and against a more personal principle. In all of this, there is a fundamental yes or no, a for or an against, a good that is not of our own production. There's something beyond self-determination, even in the determination of the self to say yes or no. Moreover, something of the entire selving in its singularity is at issue in this yes and this no. But what of evil by contrast? It can be seen in the light of it can be seen in a similar light, but the philosophers tend to tilt somewhat towards that diminished element, towards something that diminishes the element of the intimate, the personal, and the revolting. There is a rationalizing of what is at issue in these elements, and though the claim is made to speak for the universal, there is sometimes an enfeebling of the singular and the intimate. So again, just introductory remarks, I think something of a more general contrast is here at stake. One thinks, of course, of the ancient contrast of logos and mythos, and the tendency of the rationalizing philosophers to demythologize the personal stories of the divine. An impersonal principle is suggested as more ultimate than a personal power, both in the human soul and in the ultimate sources of being beyond ourselves. And a question, I think, which will be asked, I think, during this conference also, and ought to be asked, is whether the mythic, or more generally the imagistic character of the religious narrative is a limited or defective mode of articulation to be superseded by a more rational account of things, or whether the religious narrative is precisely the most appropriate form of narrative here, and especially in relation to evil, and most fittingly so if evil communicates something of a defect or defection that voids the structure of rational intelligibility or warps the energy of the willing that loves the good. Do sin and evil require the memorial image more primally than the explicating concept? The ambiguous narrative, does it require the ambiguous narrative that reminds us in a kind of May-ontological rhetoric of a happening of undoing? So again, this thought will come back again a little bit later, and in my third part a little bit more. But now let me just say a few things about Hegel's, the main lineaments of Hegel's view of evil. He offers his most extensive account of evil in the lectures on the philosophy of religion. Though scattered throughout the large systematic works are many mentions of the issue, especially the story of the fall, presented as a Vorstellung illustrating the dialectical development of the spirit. So again, just very broadly, three major emphases I find in Hegel's account of evil. First, I'd call it a logicist or ontologicist emphasis, where the very conceptual structure of dialectical self-mediation through otherness is evident in his account of sin as it is throughout the system as a whole. So in other words, Hegel's logic is present throughout a system as a whole, but the happening of evil is an illustration of the logic. Now that's the logicist, ontologicist emphasis. A second emphasis I would call the existential emphasis, in which the notion of particularity is important. And again, Hegel will emphasize particularity, but also this will be surpassed. And that'll be an important point later. And then a third emphasis I would call a world historicist or a world historical emphasis. So if there's a tension between the logicist and the existentialist, Hegel has a tendency to seek for a resolution by moving to the dimension of the world historical, in relation to evil also, and world history in a certain sense, for him, provides the place where the existential and the ontologicist are reconciled. Incidentally, again, for those of you who are interested in Trinitarian theology, that triadic structure is very much present in the way he looks at God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. God the Father is sort of the abstract universality. God the Son is the particular, also identified with creation as such in Hegel's way of thinking. And the Holy Spirit is, in fact, in the end, identified with the religious community. And a point that I'll come back to later is Hegel's claim. I believe Hegel supersedes the religious community in terms of the political, worldly state as the most ultimate embodiment of reconciliation. And that has, I think, important effects also on understanding evil. Okay, so turning to the story of the fall, he first of all uses it to illustrate the ontological necessity of differentiation. Now, he rejects any literal or historical interpretation of the representation. And again, that echoing the question about logos and mythos, and whether, for Hegel, his sense of logos supersedes the religious Vorstellung as a mythic and figurative way of talking, which isn't fundamentally important. No, it's not ultimately important, rather. In Hegel's account, the importance of knowing is stressed. So the differentiation that occurs in creation and in evil are inseparable from the emergence of the human being out of a condition of animal innocence. So his view of Adam and Eve in the garden in a sense is taken as the figure for innocent nature. And unless differentiation, rupture, cleavage in a strong sense comes to be, then the human being would have remained simply an innocent animal, continuous in a homogeneous way with the rest of the animal kingdom. So Hegel wants to universalize the implicit meaning of the fall. He is concerned with implicit humanity according to its concept, he says, not the represented individuals, Adam and Eve. Even the notion of inherited sin he ties to the begriff or concept, not to some quasi-biological inheritance. As he says, all humanity, as humanity, enters into this cleavage. So again, the details here is that once the fruit is eaten, the sense of difference enters into the world. And hence, in a fundamental sense, evil is necessary for the process of differentiation to become. He also says this cleavage, which is the English translation of Entzweiung, a kind of endoubling. He also thinks that this is the midpoint of conversion that consciousness contains within itself, whereby the cleavage itself is sublated. So again, you have a sense of logic governing the whole. Difference is necessary to move beyond the initial state of innocent unity. But difference developed is also something that contains the possibility of reconciliation between the two opposites. And it's all part of one whole process that takes place. So in other words, this knowing of evil is a necessity, but at the same time it's a dialectical elevation of the human being. In a certain sense, it constitutes our humanity or elevation to the promise of humanity as such. And this is the kind of background to my title. Hegel takes some glee in pointing out that the promise of the serpent was indeed redeemed. The serpent did not lie. Human beings will become as gods in eating of the tree of knowledge. And he goes on to point out that this is not contradicted by God, who says, "Look, they have become like us, knowing good and evil." Now again, I'll come back to that again later, this endorsement. But in any case, it is the knowing of good and evil that will make us gods. Fruit of the fall, that will prove dialectically necessary to the self-elevation of humanity. But the question could be asked, if the transgression is necessary, does not this alter its taint qua transgression? If the transgression had to be, if humanity were to become the spirit it implicitly is this not a rational justification of evil's necessity? In vindicating the serpent, does this rational necessity bow in the direction of the Prince of Darkness? For Hegel, the Prince of Darkness is Lucifer, but he is also the firstborn son of the light. There's an interesting 2 sentences in the Phenomenology where very, very quickly this firstborn of the light appears only almost immediately to be superseded by the good son. So they're kind of here and there. I suppose there would be certain Gnostic strains in Hegel that are well worth looking at more closely. There is a discussion of immortality in Hegel's account also. I'll just briefly mention it here, but the most important thing to say is that in the end, Hegel, in my view, simply denies any possibility of personal immortality. He tends to think of immortality as bound up with cognition and thought as such. So again, the shift from the particular to the universal, or a more encompassing totality, is evident in his account of immortality. The tension between, as I put it earlier, existential particularity and logicist universality tends to be resolved in terms of, in fact, a concrete universality that unfolds in humanity's historical development. Now, I can't do justice to all of that because in Hegel's account, he goes through the different religions actually as instantiating the move from unity through difference towards reconciliation. And there's a process also of the inwardization of this sense of cleavage that reaches its most intensive expression in the Christian religion, in fact, as a religion of inwardness. But of course, in the Christian religion, then, the opposition is developed to an extremity. The extremity for Hegel is the turning point of conversion in which the opposites turn towards each other, and the possibility of reconcilement is offered. So again, those are many details. But so I'll just sum up then. In sum, Hegel endorses the serpent understood as the beneficent inviter to knowing, not the seducer who beguiles us away from divine ways. The refusal serves as the necessary opening that allows an affirmation of knowing. It is evil, but there is no sin in it. One could wonder if this denial of sin is Hegel's own sin. I briefly stressed the shift to world history in Hegel's Theodicy, but again, what of sin? I mentioned at the beginning the contrast of Logos and Mythos, and it is present in the contrast of Begriff and Vorstellung in Hegel. I mention this again here since sin would belong to the space of Vorstellung for Hegel, not properly to the space of Begriff. There is evil for Hegel, but I think only a merely representational sense of sin, which in the end is not sin at all, but an advance to self-knowing and self-determination. Religious narrative is relativized by his philosophical concept. This is even true when Hegel tells his own philosophical story in terms of philosophical history. Every religious tale of divine transcendence is superseded by the politics of worldly immanence. This is especially evident in the philosophy of history, where political revolution supersedes and completes religious reform. Remember, the Protestant Reformation, and this is Hegel's view of history, is only completed in a worldly sense by the immanent embodiment of freedom in the modern state. A dimension of this is also evident in the philosophy of right, where the ethical state supersedes individual Kantian morality. Now again, this sense of morality and ethics is interesting because there's a kind of a transmoral sense of good and evil in Hegel, but is it religious in the sense in which sin is? All of this is governed by the idea of freedom as the free will that wills the free will. That's a phrase I want to draw to your attention. It's paragraph 27 of the Philosophy of Right, when Hegel talks about the idea of freedom as the free will that wills the free will. And this notion of the will willing itself is something that I'm going to take up now in somewhat different terms. It's an extraordinary phrase, and it's continuous with a certain drive to absolutize a certain sense of autonomous self-determination in modernity. This willing is to be objectified in a social self-determination most fully in the modern state. There is something transmoral in Hegel, but it is ethical in his specifically immanent worldly sense. Evil here is not sin, but it seems the historical theodicy will be its redemption. The city of God comes to earth, but it is no longer the city of God, but the modern state. The autonomous city of modern man as entirely self-determining. I would say that the logic of the will willing itself and its consummate social self-determination constitute the immanent theodicy of world history for Hegel. Theodicy is often presented as the justification of God by knowledge that puts evil in his place, but once again, does not Hegel's theodicy seem more a justification of evil than of God? Is Hegel then of the party of Satan, as Blake said of Milton? And is this knowing God, knowing something monstrous and mad and evil in the very odyssey to redeem itself? Because again, this is a theme which I haven't mentioned at all, but sometimes it's almost as if God is redeeming himself. Hegel's God is self-alienating and self-redeeming in the historical process itself. So just one last question with Hegel. Does Hegel's endorsement of the serpent lead to the sin of philosophical inversion of theodicy into cacodicy? Okay, so that's my second section. Let me see how I'm doing for time. And let me now just turn to what I'm calling a transmoral sense of evil, and further whether this has something that asks us to take more seriously as philosophers the dimension of singular revolt that I mentioned at the outset in connection with sin, and the philosopher's tendency to shy away from it in the direction of something that can be rendered in more impersonal terms. So I want to pursue this question in connection with the notion of the will as willing itself, and how there can be a deep equivocity in the notion of freedom as the free will that wills the free will. This equivocity has something to do with the question of whether freedom, far from being self-determining as such, is from the outset an endowed freedom. That is to say, given to be as for itself, but not giving itself to be, and hence endowed with power that is not simply self-empowering, but which always refers to its being received as itself from a source other than itself. The religious, the monotheists, call this source God. So evil and sin will have something to do with the willing of will that revolts against its being endowed, and in willing to will itself refuses the porosity to what endows it to be as self-affirming at all. So a question here that comes up, I think, especially with Hegel, there's a logic of parts and wholes, the particular and the universal. How can a part refuse, indeed, revolt against the whole? It cannot be just a part, for such a revolt seems also to exceed the whole, since it is a refusal of the whole. This is one of the deep enigmas of evil at its extremities. If it's just a part revolting against the whole, it can't just be any kind of a part. The part itself, in some sense, must be more than the whole. A logic of parts and whole will not do. And the consolations of that kind of immanence will have to be foregone. So now, just a little exploration there. This is a very difficult thing to talk about, and I'll do my best in the time that I have by turning again to the willing itself, or the willing. So consider again the power of will to say yes or no. From where does this power arise? Yes and no arise in our willing, but they come from sources even more ontologically intimate to self, in a willingness before this will or that will. So I'm trying to talk about something prior to this will or that will. In one sense it seems to be indeterminate, but nevertheless it raises very interesting questions. This will and that will arise from a kind of ontological love of being. And again, I'm making claims here, but obviously you can ask me and attack me or whatever later. But a love of being that with its own mysterious freedom, its dark freedom, can also be an ontological refusal or hatred of being. This is something very difficult to talk about in itself, since most of what we can talk about comes later in the light of determinate will. There is a kind of darkness or dark mystery at the root of love and will that we talk about as flaring up, as fiery when it happens, but that in itself is not absolutely self-possessed. In fact, one wonders if there is a certain being possessed in a certain sense. In other parts of my work, I talk about the difference between what I call the passio essendi and the conatus essendi. The patience of being, the passio essendi, the conatus of being as the endeavour to be. I try to argue that this patience of being, this passio, is more primordial than the conatus, and it's very much at stake here in terms of trying to think this prior sense of willing before determinate will. If there is this being possessed, and again, that perhaps is not the best way to put it, how could it have anything to do with freedom? So I would suggest that there is a being freed, a being free, that yet is prior to a more rational self-appropriation. And this being free, or being freed, is more in the nature of a love, even a being loved, already at work in our being. It is a love of being, a love of the good, not one that we have, but one which we are. We are in this love. We are in love. We are this love. And this primal love that we are goes on to define itself in many different ways. And some of these form determinate ways of living that stifle the deeper source of loving, which now and then flares up again. This love means that in our deepest ontological roots, we are a kind of porosity. In religious terms, a porosity to the divine and its good. That love is freedom in the most intimate ontological sense, and love's being, both in itself and in what is other, even though proximately it knows this intimate love in its own love of being in itself. The radical refusal or mutation of the porous love takes place in this darkness of the soul in which the fragile love becomes a no to what it sees as thwarting its own participation in the good, its own possession of the good. The mutation flares forth as a kind of ontological jealousy. So jealousy is very interesting, something both recalcitrantly irrational, and yet deeply understandable. It reveals something of the absolute quality of wanting to have the beloved. One of the great studies of jealousy, of course, is Othello. And of course, Othello ends up killing Desdemona, but it's the warping of a love that constitutes the hatred of his jealousy. But it's in the roots itself, the warping of the love remains so enigmatic. The absolute quality of wanting to have the beloved, and the fragile powerlessness expressed in the will to have absolute power over the beloved. And all this a matter of love, but love in the double power to say yes and no. The freedom of this power makes it, in a certain sense, an absolute power in the human being. It is always already stirring, fermenting in our being, because before we are moderated by explicitly rational self-consciousness. So we find that jealousy flares up in us. It is the singular absoluteness in the being for self of the human being that is flaring, giving expression to itself, when its finite fragility touches on, impinges on its being for itself as absolutely willing itself. Now, I apologize for the complication of these formulations, but take my word for it. They're efforts to try and find a precision in something that is absolutely like a fog. In religious terms, I'm talking about a kind of jealousy of God. But how make sense of this? For is not God the absolute good, and hence the most worthy of our absolute love? I think the question of sin here could be, can there flare up in the soul a jealousy of that absolute good? And how is this possible? I don't know of any answer except this. It's possible just because the good is not mine. One of the most perplexing things about human beings is the fact that we can hate excellence, just as we love it at the same time. We love it because it is our nature, our being, to love excellence. We hate it because it is not ours. It is manifested in another, communicated from another. Our very being is communicated for another, and hence our being, in the deepest ontological freedom of its selving, is always tempted with this mutation, the mutation of love of good into hatred of it, even as the hatred secretly must offer its admiration to what it hates and love. This is what I would call a hyperbolic, paradoxical mutation of the will. Instead of the first willingness being what it is, a free porosity to the giving and ultimate good, it now becomes an absolute willing of its own will. The will turned around itself becomes a counterfeit of the first porous willingness. It affirms itself as another willingness, intimate to and often secret, but also before all other determinate acts of will that skew these determinate acts relative to the primal porosity. So I suspect that it is somewhere in this darkening of our willingness relative to the primal porosity that we are to find the most intimate source of being evil. But then how look in that darkness? How look at that darkness, since when we look, we seem to see nothing? How do you look at nothing? Now again, you might say that what's this? I'll give you an example from literature, just very briefly mentioned, which I think is absolutely extraordinary. Shakespeare's Macbeth is one of the most extraordinary explorations of the equivocity of evil. And Macbeth himself, the notion of curse and blessing, damnation and redemption are absolutely central. But you know the famous scene where Lady Macbeth tries to wash out the spot. Out, damned spot, out, I say. But the extraordinary thing is that there's nothing there. There's nothing on her hands. Early on in the play, she had said to Macbeth, a little water clears us of this deed. Macbeth, his mind is in disarray after the murder, and he says, I can no longer say amen. Why does amen stick in my throat? She says, you shouldn't think it that way. So it'll make us mad. It makes her mad, but she's trying to wash out what is nothing. I, in an article that I've written on this, I call it a sticky evil. There's nothing there, but it sticks. The nothing sticks, and it can't be purged in any finite way, it seems. So this is the nothing which, in a sense, sticks to us, even though, again, there is nothing there. And that's a way, in a sense, of talking about evil, not just as a determinate problem, but as a mystery in perhaps the Marcellian sense. And I think that this is a very relevant consideration for our deliberations today, whether in fact there is no problem of evil. If a problem is something that is determinable and always anticipates a determinate solution, perhaps there is the mystery of iniquity in the dimension of something hyperbolic to all problems. And as such, if there is an answer, can only be answered in terms of a good that itself is hyperbolic to all problematic considerations. Okay, I'm not far off. I have another few paragraphs which I'd like to just look at. And again, this sense of the will willing itself and the singular absoluteness invested in the will. And just one or two remarks on a great image of this again, and it's interesting how one has to come back to images rather than philosophical concepts. I think of Milton's Satan, one of the great creations of world literature. And this is what I would say. It is jealousy of God that makes it impossible for Lucifer, the bearer of the light, to give himself over to joy in being as gifted by God. But you can ask yourself the question, how can light counterfeit light? After all, Lucifer is the bearer of light. So if Lucifer is a counterfeit of God, how does the light counterfeit light? A very difficult problem. But Milton leaves us in no doubt that the light of willing has mutated into, again, what he calls immortal hate. And it even is seductive with a kind of sublimity. And again, famous lines that all of you know, I'm sure, from "What though the field be lost, all is not lost. The unconquerable will and study of revenge, immortal hate, and courage never to submit or yield." This gives of Satan a sublimity which is found attractive by some people. But these are some of the better known expressions of his superbia. Non serviam, I will not serve. Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. Evil be thou my good. And again, that's a question which could be asked. Can you, in fact, in all honesty, say, evil be thou my good? But I want to just draw attention to this. There is a few lines in the Paradise Lost where even Satan is not immune to goodness and beauty. There's a passage where, it's an extraordinary passage, where he's just come into Eden and seeing if he can find a way to actually isolate Eve and seduce her on her own. But he sees the first humans and he's overtaken with a sense of their extraordinary beauty and goodness. He's overtaken at the first sight of this beauty. And the line that I find lovely in Milton, and he says, Satan for the time remained stupidly good, of enmity disarmed. The word stupid, I think the word stupid there is used very intentionally by, stupid has a sense of something that stupefies us. It's not just stupid, as we say in America, stupid. There was the opera singer who died some months ago was called La Stupenda. Her name escapes me now, a memo pause. But La Stupenda, stupendous, something too much, something excessive about the very goodness and beauty of what is. In any case, only for a moment is he stupidly good, of enmity disarmed, and then he gathers his opposing will and remembers that his project is the defacement of God's goodness by the corruption of his creatures. This is what one might call decreation, an entirely active malevolence. And another deeply provocative phrase that I think we could also meditate on is what Coleridge used to describe Iago, going back to the discussion of Othello, the reference to Othello. He says that Iago is characterized by motiveless malice, motiveless malignity rather, motiveless. But if it's malice, it's moved. So how could a movement of the will, as it were, be motiveless? A strange paradoxical combination. We sometimes entertain ourselves with these possibilities, and another image, again, I am of this malevolent decreation, and I think of Salieri as portrayed in the film Amadeus. But it goes deeper than entertainment, even though the beauty of Mozart's music softens the horror. There is the idiocy of the divine gift of inspiration that Mozart has been given. It is beyond the self-determination of Salieri. Salieri the dutiful, the competent, the refined, the excellent even. But there is something more that cannot be commanded by self-determination. The flash, the inspiring fire. What flashes instead? The counterfeit double of the inspiring fire, namely jealousy. This is envy of the good of creative power, the gifted excellence in the hyperbolic dimension. It is the flare of a love that is hatred. Salieri sets out to destroy Mozart. But that is not the real point. The real point is meontological. It is to undo the work of creation. It is to uncreate what God has created. The commitment of this active malice of undoing is imaged in the scene where Salieri abjures his previous reasonable dutifulness to God, takes the crucifix down from the wall and consigns it to the crackling fire. Brilliant scene presenting that sense of... It's interesting, actually, it should be brought up. Aquinas talks about envy in a very striking way as sorrow over another's good. Just as he says that charity, envy is the opposite of charity. Charity is rejoicing in the good of another. So again, the relation between oneself and another and the good of the other that isn't one's own is very much here present also. So to conclude, one might even say in a sense that there is a sense in which the serpent is to be endorsed, and perhaps even Hegel in a certain way, though perhaps not in Hegel's way. After all, God seems to agree. Look, they have become like us, knowing good and evil. We might even conclude that in a certain sense, being God is being evil. Being God is being evil, the endeavour to be God by a being that is not God. And here we see what I would call a counterfeit double. a certain counterfeit of absolute good is being evil. And the question that could be asked is if there could be a formal or a final formal account of this. For the form could be the same, but the energy coursing in it could be absolutely different. Thus, for instance, love and hate might mirror each other formally, but the sameness would be absolute, would be radical difference. For the energy of love would circulate in one form, the energy of hate in the other form. Directionality counts. There is human willing turned towards the light that is not its own. There is human willing turned towards itself as its own light. There is human willing turned away from the light because turned to itself as its only light. The corruption of the best is the worst. Even on the heights, there are counterfeit doubles of God. Thank you.
We have about 15 minutes for a discussion now, so if there are comments, questions, or counter-proposals, this is the time to indicate them.
I'm trying to get this fascinating talk in the conceptual schemes I'm more familiar with. And as a provocation, if I would replace your word of love, which is preceding a weakness and an envy becoming a will to willing will, which is a very Heideggerian form to describe the essence of ontology. If I would replace this word love now with the word being, then I would have more or less the Heideggerian picture of this scene. I mean, he would say there is an original being and an attitude towards being, and then there is, he doesn't explain really the accident, but then there is a beginning of sort of appropriating this being and to turn it into an entity, and this ends up as the will, which identifies itself with being, and it becomes the will, willing. And this is his reading of Nietzsche. So, well, in purely philological terms, it's obvious that when Heidegger speaks about Nietzsche, he actually speaks already about Hegel. But so my question would be: is this a possible replacement, or what would be then the relation between this being and love?
Yeah.
Which is, of course, I mean, this question is in a sense at the heart of many discussions on the place of ontology in present phenomenology.
Yeah.
I mean, I want to add, I was fascinated by the description of what happens to love before it becomes envy, weakness, and willing. Yeah.
Well, I would say that in the, it's not present in what I said today, but there is a different ontology of both being and love at work in what I'm doing. So I think, I mean, I'm not making so much an anti-Heideggerian point as trying to push the sense of being in a direction where, in fact, the inseparability of being and being in love becomes more evident. And as I've developed it in Being in the Between and elsewhere, a more agapeic sense of being as, in some sense, endowed by a surplus generosity. Again, these are words taken from what we know in human love itself, but referring to something that enables, in fact, our own human finite forms of loving. So I don't think that Heideggerian ontology pushes in that direction. There's a certain sense in what I'm calling the porosity of being is touched upon by Heidegger's efforts to open into something more original, let's say, than determinate truth or determinations. But I would try to give an account of this other space, not just merely as an indeterminacy, In fact, I use the language of overdetermination specifically in relation to Hegel, because he has a triadic logic of indeterminate, determinate, and self-determining. And there is something other, but I call it the overdeterminacy of being, this surplus too muchness, which is not certainly fittable into a triadic dialectical logic. But then it's in trying to characterize this porous opening to what exceeds us that probably the difference would emerge. And the fact that Heidegger says that sin has no place in a philosophical question seems to me to already indicate that that opening in the porosity doesn't, for him, engage the philosopher with something that has an intimacy opening to, let's say, the more personal dimensions of the divine as found within the monotheistic traditions. So what it means to be in love, what love means, all of those things would have to come up for more further determination, and hence what it means to will. I mean, I take Hegel's will, or the will that wills itself, as understanding something about the hubris of modern subjectivity, to be sure. And I think I would not be in disagreement with many things about him there. But this exploration of the deeper roots of willing in this prior opening, very, very difficult thing to do, in fact, but I think it has huge intimate connections with what it means to love and to be in love, and indeed not only that, but to be loved, and the sense of evil as a mutation. So it's in some ways it's not quite a deprivation theory. It's not kind of a theory of evil as negativity. It's a kind of, I don't know what the right word is, but it's in the turning around of what is good in a direction that turns it from the good, that the good itself becomes evil. That's why how hate and love can in some ways really mirror each other, but the directionality in which they are pointed can be quite opposite. I don't know if that helps or not. I mean, it's a very difficult question. It will require a book, in fact, I think.
I have 4 questions. Professor Head.
Thank you very much. 2 comments, questions to first of all, going back now, not forward to does it work this? Yeah, okay. To Heidegger, but back to Rousseau has a distinction between amour propre, amour, and amour de soi-même.
Yeah.
And I wonder to what extent you think this distinction for Hegel and for your presentation has any relevance, because for Rousseau, the way to overcome egoistical love is precisely the amour de soi-même, which means relating to the universal, to the rational and the universal of humanity itself, and of course to the volonté générale and so on and so forth. That is, I think it's not by chance that for Rousseau, the way to overcome the egoistical love, directionality towards oneself, is by linkage with the universal elements in oneself. I wonder whether you could comment on that. And this relates to some extent to my second question, which is, from a historical perspective, I think it's not by chance that your references were, first of all, to Shakespeare and Milton on the one hand, and then to Blake and Coleridge on the other. And I think that there's here a very significant, if I may say, historical change in Western consciousness, namely that it's just by the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th that the whole issue of original sin, of the serpent, and question of evil re-emerges, while in the previous 120, 130 years this question has been relegated to the background, and I think not by chance. And it's not coincidental that Rousseau, on the one hand, offers that solution to egoistical will, and on the other, of course, denies altogether the existence of original sin and sees the social dimension as the ultimate response to the problem of evil.
Yeah, thank you very much for two very good questions and interventions. On the Rousseau thing, if my paper was fully developed and understood, it would be an argument against just simply using the dyad of the particular and the universal as ways of addressing the full dimensions of what's at play. The way Rousseau's response in many respects is typically philosophical, in the sense that the problem is the particular self-will or the self-love, and the solution is somehow surrender to the universal. Whereas I'm trying to argue that there's something prior to the particular self-will that opens out into a different sense of universality, in fact, that isn't just simply the, in my view, abstract universality of the philosophers, or indeed even the concrete universality of Hegel as a philosopher. In some other work that I'm preparing, and here I referred once or twice to it, I'm trying to develop the notion of what I call the intimate universal. The intimate universal is one in which something of the ultimate principle has to have characteristics that are more like the personalistic principle or God of the monotheistic tradition, not the impersonal universal that the philosophers love so much, but that a way to explore it is actually by trying to return into an intimacy in the human being that is prior to determinate forms of our particular selvings. So like that distinction that I just very quickly mentioned between the conatus essendi and the passio essendi, there's a patience of being that opens into this more primordial porosity that doesn't get any mention in this kind of... I know, Rousseau does have that sense of an elemental compassion, which seems to be even prior to us becoming human in a proper sense. But I think that there's an ontological significance in this prior porosity that is, in a certain sense, almost a way to try to think Augustine's great description when he talks about God as interior intimo meo, more interior to me, more intimate to me than I am to myself. So if there's such an intimacy, it's a doubled intimacy. It's not just my intimacy to myself, it's rather something... How could you even think about it, since we are so intimate with ourselves in a certain sense? So, strangely enough, Rousseau fits into the camp of the philosophers. I would think that your point about the romantic engagement, of course, Milton is prior to that, but he was a great hero, of course, to many of the romantics, as you know. I think it has something to do with how, in the previous 2 centuries, a culture of rational, autonomous self-determination dominated the field immensely in how we understand ourselves and how we even think of the divine as more than ourselves, to such an extent that the divine as more than ourselves becomes entirely problematic or indeed eclipsed. So the return of this sense of evil and this interiority in a certain sense is partly reactive against the spiritual kind of anorexia of a more rationalistic configuration of things. But of course, I think that the fact that something like original sin isn't deeply explored has something to do with the fact that the culture of seeing ourselves as autonomous and self-determining still overrides this more primordial patience. So hence, Satan becomes the hero of Paradise Lost for Blake and others. But when you read Paradise Lost closely, I'm astonished how again and again and again Milton is in a way even mocking Satan as a parody of the divine, that everything that Satan has in Paradise Lost is always borrowed. And, it's a misreading, if you like, but understandable in the light of certain considerations. But on the other hand, then, this opening to kind of romantic inwardness, if you want to call it that, it does open up dimensions at work in our very being which can't be fitted into this space of rational self-determination as understood by the standard forms of enlightenment. And indeed, and perhaps this will come up in a further paper today, Kant, it's a very interesting instance of this, the great defender of pure reason, and yet towards the end writing on radical evil in the human being. Some kink in the works that somehow makes things more difficult for a purely rational account.
I'm next on the list, and then Shensheni is the last one before we go to the next speech. My reflection is that it became very clear that for you the distinction, or at least that for you as presented in this talk, that for you, as at least as presented in this thought, there is a sense in which the distinction between good and evil is the basis for being human. Now, in what way? First of all, what you see is that all detachment from the world, in a sense, must be evil because it assumes the fall, it assumes being thrown out or separation, so that it is an act of separation from a primary good. There always has to be a good before there can be an evil in this particular view, and this detachment in itself then motivates the desire to destroy the good, because it gives you cannot have the desire to destroy the good from inside the good, you must step outside of it, up to there.
But the thing is, in the third part of my paper today, I was really trying to, from within the good itself, talk about a mutation of the fundamental love that actually issues in a hatred. So it was, I'm trying to address that last point there in my what is more singular to my own reflections. And still maintain that good and love of the good is primary. So there's a deep, I don't think that there is actually, I often wonder, is there any rational answer to the nature of that mutation? If that's the right way to talk about it, because we have to be very diffident and cautioned in all of this talking, if there is this mutation, it occurs prior to the possibility of rational structure itself, because in the very mutation itself there is a no to rational structure, because it's a kind of destructuring. It's the no that decreates, even though it thinks of itself as, in a sense, either the rival or the successor to the divine yes. So in other words, part of my paper here was bringing the question of evil to a kind of limit where many standard philosophical ways of talking simply don't do justice to the difficulty that's at issue.
Thank you very much for your presentation. You mentioned Kant. After building his outstanding rational system, when he gets to talk about radical evil, something changes. And I think it's a very interesting point. I think also Schelling is answering him by exposing a different metaphysics which shows the irrational power and the visuality of evil. And I think it's very interesting to see that this irrationality has this aspect, this visual or artistic aspect that you used a lot. You used a lot of images while trying to explain this priority of evil and the connection between evil and love. And I think there is something that we as researchers or people or every human being that is interested in this point has to think, why is our images so central to our thinking about evil? And what is the connection, the deep connection between evil and the way things are presented to us or imposed on us? And the last thing I would like to hear what is your opinion shortly, is about, we spoke last time you've been here about Scheller. And I get the feeling that the last things you said about love, about the priority of love, and about love as a basic principle of spirituality or way consciousness involved in the world, are very similar in a sense to what Scheller is speaking about in his ethics. Thank you.
Schiller.
Scheller, Max Scheller, yeah.
Scheller, yes. Okay, I was thinking of Schiller. and sort of.
I don't speak German, so.
No, it's
no, of the 20th
Marx
century, the
syntax,
phenomenology.
Yeah. On the first thing about images, I mean, it's again bound up as a continuation of the response to the last question, that if there's something in the event or happening or unevent or de-happening of evil that exceeds rational structure, there's something there that actually can't be simply captured by an intelligible discourse. But an image could capture it. I early on said the memorial image rather than the explicating concept. Memorial in the sense of reminding us of something that is going on, that we can't quite put our fingers on in a fully intelligible way, but nevertheless we have some recognition and understanding that this is absolutely crucial. The word image is probably a little bit too soft in the end, because of course I'm calling on great images from great literature. But in fact I think that the human being itself can image, so that this element of the intimate and the personal, often our sense of what it is to be good is not gleaned from the book or from the image or from the rational discourse, but from the witness of a good human being, or the discovery that someone who is a friend, let's say, is a betrayer, so the counterfeit doubling thing. So the very living of the good, or the not living of the good in that intimate, personal way, is the place, in fact, where these realities are unfolded for us. And hence, as a philosopher, you have a vocation to be absolutely attentive and mindful to these things that perhaps don't get into the books at all, or into the poetic images. So that would be the reply. So it's a kind of inversion of Hegel in the sense that there's something about the Vorstellung that is absolutely more absolute in a sense than the Begriff when it comes to certain things like evil. On Scheler, I think you asked me about Scheler when I was here the last time, and I didn't answer that time either. That means I'm not going to answer this time either, but because I read lots of Scheler years ago and I have many good intentions, and he is one that I wanted to go back and read more carefully again. I'm particularly interested in his discussion of ressentiment in contrast with Nietzsche's interpretation of it. But that's one of my. I need a memorial courses on. So, but I can't give what to me would be a satisfying answer to how I relate to Scheler at the moment, because he's not as fresh in my mind as he should be. Okay.
Thank you very much. I think we will, without further ado, proceed to our second talk, which is given by our own, Professor Christoph Schmidt, who is here on behalf of both the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute. He's written a myriad of books. I remind you of the Heretical Imperative of a few years ago, and his thought is certainly, in many cases, subversive, I would say. Whoa. So it's a pleasure to introduce Professor Schmidt, who will address us about the subject of After Sin, a reflection on a modern taboo. Please.
Yeah, thank you, Gabi, very much. And this is, of course, after this heavyweight philosophy is a bit more lightweight, I think. But maybe it has its place, this kind of discourse I'm presenting. These are actually kind of preliminary reflections, or sometimes even impressions, on what one could call the fate of sin in modern enlightened discourse, which we have learned is basically one that wishes to get rid of this concept. And these considerations lead me to thoughts about the necessity of a reassessment of the disappearance of sin in the secular, let's say, discourse. And I will adopt here the mode of a post-secular dialogue conceived by who was then Ratzinger, is now the Pope, and the philosopher Jürgen Habermas, on a possibility of a dialogue between secular reason and dogmatic belief, which would be both a critique of the other and a critique of the self in this concept of dialogue. And my suggestion will be that this kind of dialogue, which is just here debated as a possibility, has been actually developed by Søren Kierkegaard as a philosophical strategy, which one could call a strategy of dialogical action, which by activating the dogmatic discourse of sin in his critique of secular freedom, is maybe the best formula or model for this kind of post-secular communication. So let me begin with the impressions and reflections, and before I go a bit into Kierkegaard as a thinker of possible critique of all that I'm going to present right now. A certain avant-garde of the secular culture of autonomy has invented a new sin, namely the sin of having invented sin. In the name of its anti-religious attitude, which promotes the liberation from the irrational powers of the past, this autonomous subject has, of course, to eliminate this sin of all sins. The Church and, in her suit, the State have, according to this logic, invented sin as a conspiracy in order to control and suppress original freedom and eros of the humans, and have consolidated this control with the help of a whole set of dogmas. But the elimination of this major sin, to have invented sin, suffered, as it seems, some delay. Since the 18th century, with the beginning of the modern enterprise of freedom, the project of the abolition of sin became a function of the radicality of the utopian idea. Kant's idea of the kingdom of God was, after all, counterbalanced by the anthropology of radical evil. But it was replaced by more radical utopian versions which developed visions of a humanity beyond all sin. These versions follow a double logic which can be formulated in two equations, so to say the two politico-theological axioma. First, the more radical utopia becomes, the more it will abolish sinfulness. Two, the less sin there is to be found in a utopia, all the more this utopia will invent its enemy and engage in a war with this enemy. The ideal of a humanity beyond sin had to compensate its impossibilities by the creation of an absolute enemy, namely the enemy of class and race, who prevented the realization of utopia and thus had to be, in fact, eliminated. This mechanism of transference from the internal sin to the external absolute enemy, described so well by Eric Voegelin and René Girard, generated the ultimate evils which have darkened so much the modern age in the 20th century. After the appearance of these evils in the concentration camp and the Gulag, radical utopia has lost most of its appeal and was replaced by a political realism, a liberalism somewhere between conservatism and social democracy, which wants to restore the idea of enlightened culture on a skeptical basis. But trying to live up to the idea of a moderate enlightenment, this culture has kept its basic instinct against religion, church, and monotheism as the enemies of progress and, of course, the inventors of sin. Lately, this instinct has even adopted interesting theories of a monotheist conspiracy against the free human eros, and I just remind of Jan Assmann's mosaic distinction, Odo Marquardt's return to polytheism, or on a more popular level, the Da Vinci Code. As long as, well, that's a case in point, as long as religion and its institution exist, and although their influence in the West is vanishing to 0 degree, this late skeptical reason is still haunted by the possibility of a radiation and contamination which sin caused by its pure presence. It does not really help here when the Church, since Vatican II, confesses her own sins in her attitude towards the modern idea of freedom, which she has in the past rejected in the name of her dogmatic belief. This basic acceptance of the modern secular concept of freedom, together with this confession of sin, have been overheard by the new skeptic for some time, so that one must suspect that after the wild excesses of secular eschatology and utopia with their ultimate evils, this skeptic has developed by now his or her own dogmatic system and retreated into a hermetic discourse of its own. In this sense, I've written this when I was in Berlin, and as you all know, there was a visit of the Pope in Berlin. In this sense, the public debate preceding the visit of the Pope in Berlin last September was symptomatic already for a medial ritual with its own comic. The Pope was accused by secularist politicians of a violent religious penetration into the secular sphere, while the Pope himself in fact declared that there was no greater gift for the Church than secularization, since it made a fundamental Entweltlichung, a radical desecularization of the Church, possible. It was easier to repeat the classical attacks against celibacy as the source of all sins than to listen to this interesting voice. But one could not avoid the impression that skepticism in his or this hermetic version was on the way to demonstrate the loss of its last resort of coherence. First, on a psychosociological level, the front against Catholic celibacy coincides for some time with the astonishing effects of a simultaneous admiration for the very Dalai Lama, who does not lead a less celibitarian life than the priest next door. Two, on a more fundamental level, the secular demand for liberty in erotic matters, held against the denunciation of eros as sin, does not tolerate any exceptions from this erotic freedom and thereby turns into a new form of coercion. Now, everybody must live according to the erotic law of liberation. Three, further contradictions of the claim against celibacy reveal themselves when one considers that the insistence on the principle of erotic freedom without exception tends to become, namely in the era of a growing sexualization of culture, nothing else but a submission to drive and physical necessity itself, thus suspending the idea of freedom. Ascetics and celibacy, seen from this perspective, are of course the suspension of this suspension, since they intend a liberation from all sexual coercion, however difficult for the priestly candidate who chooses this way of life and freedom. Thanks God, celibacy is not a demand for everybody. As an opus supererogatum, an act of supererogatory ethics, this highest form of belief beyond ethical obligations, it forms together with poverty and obedience one of the three holy counsels. Finally, celibacy as the attitude of a radical and universal transcendence of all natural, social and political bonds of family, ethnos and nation is the condition of the possibility for a universal love to the neighbor beyond these borders, culminating in fact in the radically communist community of the monastery based on free will too. By attacking the Church on the basis of erotic freedom, the secular skeptic mind has blinded itself for the fact that its own highest ideas of universalism and utopia behind its own reach are in fact still alive but implemented elsewhere within the Church. So that fits the concept of the envy of the good. This secular attack against celibacy reveals its own effects of a dialectics of enlightenment then, if it does not become an involuntary confession of the incoherence of its arguments, or, should one say, of its sins against its own very idea and ideal of freedom itself. But this is precisely the problem. By eliminating the concept of sin, the modern skeptic cannot deal with his own logical and existential contradictions. Strange signs of a time, already the mentioning of concepts like sin, celibacy, or worse, of chastity or virginity, provoke reactions today recalling the anger and outcry once typical for the generation of our grandparents when one mentioned certain words belonging to our sexual life. This anger seems by now to indicate the appearance of a new kind of neurosis, unforeseen by Freud, and still without a name in the list of psychological pathologies, namely the neurosis as a consequence of this interesting reverse of suppression, namely the suppression of the spiritual, religious and ethical ways of love, of which sin is a central component. This reverse seems to demand a new kind of psychoanalysis, a theo-psychoanalysis, so to speak, dealing with the repressions of the secular skeptic and his distorted reality principle. In light of these contradictions and socio-psychological symptoms, some of them bearing their own comics, the time might have come now to awaken from the skeptic slumber and reconsider the mysteries of the dogma, namely the dogma of sin itself. And indeed, one might ask, is there any more skeptical concept than the concept of sin, which does mistrust the splendor of utopian politics as much as the virtuosic genius of skeptical reason, who for some time tends to practice the opposite of what he or she so solemnly preaches? Would it not be necessary to introduce the dogma not as a strategy of the cancellation of the modern orientation towards freedom, but rather as an expression of enlightenment itself, an enlightenment about the skeptical enlightenment, so to speak, in order to call the skeptic out of his or her hermetic conceptual castle? So what emerges is the possibility that dogma itself could serve as a kind of critical theory of the Enlightenment. This would be, as I suggest, the task of the theologian and the preacher today, who would not be too ashamed to pronounce his dogmatic belief and activate its deconstructive powers. This theologian, if he or she are not entirely intimidated and are not only busy to adjust faith to the demands of modern society, so that nothing is left of this religion, would have to approach the dogma in light of the very perspective of the skeptical demand for freedom, in order first to reformulate the dogma as the ultimate expression of freedom, which it always already was, and at the same time, too, to subvert pure skeptical reason by pointing to its contradiction in its theory and practice of freedom. The philosophical and theological framework for such an explicit radical double strategy has been first introduced by the Protestant philosopher Søren Kierkegaard. But unfortunately, his double strategy of reading the dogma from the perspective of freedom and the idea of freedom from the perspective of dogma has been gambled away immediately when in the 1920s, that's the height and peak of the Kierkegaard reception, we had an anti-modern orthodoxy on the one hand and an atheist existentialism on the other, which split the double strategy of Kierkegaard into two parts, excluding the other side. Against this isolation, Kierkegaard's position can be described as an effort to deconstruct the idea of modern freedom with the help of the Christian dogma, while at the same time he wishes to reconstruct the dogma from the perspective of the idea of freedom in order to reveal its deconstructive and especially its therapeutic truth. In this sense, there can be no complete mediation, as there cannot be a radical self-isolation and exclusion of the other, but only a critical and self-critical dialogue between secular and religious freedom. And this dialogue is then opposed to the radical divide between theology and existentialism of the 20s, with its mutual delegitimization, as it wishes to relativize the common idea that Kierkegaard's thought of the three stages of the aesthetical, ethical, and religious represents a ladder, kind of ladder of dialectical suspensions, completing itself with the arrival at the religious stage. Between these two options, one can recognize the path of a dialogical adventure employing irony, self-irony, and critical rigor committed to the therapy of what might be called the secular neurosis. With this dialogue, Kierkegaard is, of course, adopting the Socratic principle of parrhesia, combining the idea of a free speech of truth with the effort to live oneself according to this truth. And we have learned a lot about parrhesia from the latest fine lectures from Michel Foucault. Plays an important role in all these considerations. By adopting Socratic parrhesia as a demand for an adequation between bios and aletheia, that is life and truth, he intends, and this is my central point here, to endorse actually an enlightened model which has been forgotten, or better, which enlightenment itself has neglected totally. Kierkegaard explicitly and consciously endorses the dialectical irony of the finest writer of German Enlightenment, namely of Gotthold Ephraim Lessing, who applied Socratic parrhesia in his dialogue with Lutheran orthodoxy. And with this teacher, Kierkegaard puts himself in line with Lessing's strategy, which was lost with the construction of the politico-theological utopias, the philosophical systems, and the isolationist forms of existential or dogmatic thought of early 20th century, but which is rediscovered today as the option for a post-enlightened discourse called today the post-secularity, characterized as a dialogue between autonomous secular reason and belief beyond mutual exclusion and delegitimization. I refer, of course, to the Habermas-Ratzinger debate in Munich 2004. Now, in what is left, I would like to present the thought of Kierkegaard in a very brief sketch as a radical enlightenment strategy of this kind, namely as a critical dialogue in the tradition of the Socratic ideal of parrhesia as the specific mode adopted by Lessing. Neither rendering to discursive violence against the orthodox claim for truth, nor to the idea of a fully available rational truth for enlightened reason, Lessing became, and Kierkegaard affirms that repeatedly, the true forefather of his own way of life and philosophy as a critical dialogical action. The purpose of this short reconstruction is to demonstrate then, first, the relevance of dogmatics, namely the dogmatics of sin, for the dialogue with enlightened reason, as sort of best critical theory, and two, the dogmatic form of life as the religious interpretation of freedom with its own claim to parrhesia, namely to freedom as a life in accordance with its truth. In his critique of modern philosophy of freedom and its radical idealism, Kierkegaard posits the aesthetical subject as his point of departure, since freedom has to be considered first of all as the freedom of the particular individual. Aesthetics, different from logic, deals with the individual, the concrete human appearance in flesh and blood, before it is subsumed under the universalizing concept, denying or even sacrificing this individuality. It is the individual self, then, which has to live its freedom with care and responsibility in its decisions about its future possibilities it faces in life. The point of departure does not, or this point of departure does not only question the philosophical conceptualizations ignoring individuality, but it turns, as this is always and often repeated, specifically against Hegelian philosophy, with its claims to a fully realized dialectical concept of the subject as the systematic identity of identity and difference, and as we shall see later, against the synthesis of system and dogma. As a necessary conceptual structure and totality, this subjectivity is the result of its past, ignoring, so to speak, its potential and open infinity in light of the future. But while systematic philosophy closes this infinity in an absolute totality, philosophical aesthetics, serving as the point of departure here, finds itself in another danger. Instead of a closure in the system, it hands subjectivity over to pure infinity and possibility, precisely because the individual remains beyond concept and its grasp, that is, it is indeterminable, it is in danger to understand itself as pure, infinite possibility here. This, then, is Kierkegaard's conclusion. Where Hegel's absolute subject only lives in the past without future, the radical aesthetic subject has only a future. Both lack presence. And in both these forms of a radical idealism of freedom, the individual finds itself actually paralyzed without the freedom it wanted to get access to. The philosopher can only repeat a system. The radical aesthetician does not know how to come to a decision in light of his infinite possibilities. The absolute identity of the self as concept, as well as its infinite difference as aesthetical existence, prevent the very actualization of freedom in whose name these versions of subjectivity were generated originally. From the perspective of these two absolute polarizations of freedom as absolute actuality and absolute potentiality, where the self has created itself as the paralyzed absolute, Kierkegaard develops first a still objective definition of self as the synthesis of infinity and finitude. The self realize some of its potentials in time, which can be conceptualized and totalized, whereas in light of its openness to future, it can still be considered infinite, so to speak, and to be open to other conceptualizations which might not be fulfilled within time. And the second conclusion or consequence of this is that this formal definition leads Kierkegaard to an investigation why and how the philosophy of freedom could in fact fail and got lost in the contradictions mentioned, namely either to imprison itself in a system or to paralyze itself through infinite possibility. Individual subjectivity faces, according to Kierkegaard, a fundamental insecurity, a weakness and anxiety, which make freedom a very risky thing, desirable as well as unbearable. Absolute knowledge reflects the desire to overcome the uncertainties of a fundamental non-knowledge concerning the future, while the aesthetical subjectivity reflects the desire for absolute sovereignty and power in light of the fundamental weakness of the self. These uncertainties create the fundamental anxiety of the self, which rather prefers to renounce freedom, and by renouncing freedom, this self is on the way to renounce its selfhood itself. Instead of affirming the self as freedom, then, this self is in flight before it, either through an act of self-closure or by dissolving itself in imaginary forms of self. The art of living in light of these two aspects, synthesis and anxiety, would be then to create a kind of balance between totality and infinity, a balance being always already disturbed by the attempt either to enclose oneself or to dissolve oneself absolutely. Taking refuge in one of these polar options in order to make oneself immune against finitude, the self demonstrates its fundamental despair of itself, which according to Kierkegaard unfolds in a whole range of different intensities and pathologies. In a purely neutral language, one could speak here of a fundamental forgetfulness of the ontic difference between human and divine, since the self in its synthesis of infinite and finitude in fact intends to overcome its finitude, and by this to overcome the difference between the human and the divine. Of course, both totality and infinity are imaginary and illusionary strategies to get away from finitude. But this forgetfulness is, according to Kierkegaard's analysis, due to a fully conscious will, however hiding itself behind the conceptual framework of a philosophy. In Hegel's thought, this strategy is absolutely explicit, since the construction of the absolute consciousness adopts the language of the Christian dogma in order to describe absolute subjectivity as a unity of the absolute and the finite, which has been presented on the level of religious representation as the unity of God and man. This failure of the full divinization of subjectivity did not just occur as an accident on the exodus of subjectivity from its self-inflicted minority. It appears as the function of a fundamental will, which, according to Kierkegaard, has to be conceived of as fully conscious guilt, namely the guilt of freedom itself. The self-contradiction between the project and the realization of freedom has to be understood then as a special kind of guilt, which is, according to Kierkegaard, characterized as an act against all better understanding, and in this sense fulfills the Paulinian definition of sin. Moreover, the failure of the self to establish freedom is due to the will to become the ultimate origin of oneself. Both the act against one's own better understanding and the self-construction as absolute self are the two aspects of what Christian dogma terms as the original sin, namely the conscious denial of or the rebellion against God. In its later forms, this becomes the sin against the Holy Spirit, leading itself to different forms of desperation, obstination, and so on and so on. In Martin Luther's language, which Kierkegaard, the Protestant, is committed to, the whole of human existence must be described as a permanent rebellion against the sovereignty of God and his offer of love and forgiveness. The analysis of this existential logic of freedom leads Kierkegaard to the demonstration of its contradictions, which, as responsible acts of the self, demand then a theological interpretation of these contradictions as sin. And now the decisive point here is that this theological or dogmatic dimension cannot be presented and demonstrated as a system of concepts serving as a logical solution or refutation of these contradictions, but this dimension can only be verified on the existential level in an open truth speech, which is verified on the level of one's own life. The problem of freedom is thus not only considered as a problem from the dogmatic point of view, but as the problem of the very self that confronts this problem in its own way of life, which serves as the basis for a reformulation of dogmatics in light of the problem of freedom. The self which takes its orientation from dogmatics does not only reveal the contradictions, the symptoms and pathologies of freedom, and their possible cure in belief, forgiveness, and grace, but the self is already engaged here in its own life with the actualization of dogmatic truth as a kind of deconstructive and therapeutic existence, enlightening the dead ends of the modern enlightened exodus into freedom. The whole of existence becomes oriented towards the therapy of freedom and self, both for the other and for oneself. And in analogy to the philosophical system, the self cannot detach itself from the scene of freedom and selfhood by adopting an absolute dogmatic system. Kierkegaard's whole work as author is the expression of this effort to actualize truth in word and life, transcending the purely logical or conceptual realm of the problems of freedom. This life is not only dedicated to deconstructions, but to the ethical practice of life which cannot posit itself above other humans, but rather it intends to get involved itself with the therapeutic adventure in a dialogue with the other. All of Kierkegaard's reflections on truth, freedom, and irony, and sin, seem to be centered around this effort of initiating a kind of mutual healing effort. As in the purely existential case, it is then the idea of freedom in the dogmatic context which has to be actualized as a specific form of parrhesia, an adequacy between life and truth. In analogy to the philosopher who would live in a little hut, passively watching the entrance of his splendid conceptual chateau, nothing would be worse or comical than a priest dogmatically well educated, who could give a brilliant preaching on Christ's loneliness, poverty, and his final suffering on the cross by enchanting the community to tears, and then would leave the service in an elegant Mercedes for a cocktail party on a pool, indulging in delicious food. Kierkegaard's thought remains incomplete without this complementary dimension of his attacks on academic and institutional theology, often suffering from the same contradictions and sins as the academic philosophy of freedom. The principle of freedom as the demand for a life according to truth refers always to both the purely existential and the dogmatic way of life. Rather than being a stage between the aesthetic and the religious, the ethical, as the demand for coherence between life and truth, serves as the touchstone and the point of departure for a dialogue for both. The existence in tune with dogmatics understands itself then in light of its own sins, its need for redemption and the therapeutic mission which it derives from this understanding of freedom. This mission is conceived of as an imitation of Christ, which can be nothing else but an imitation of Christ's life. It is the turn from the basic tendency of freedom to flee from finitude into imaginary forms of an infinite self to an acceptance of the self within its finite boundaries. And instead of replacing human finitude with divine infinity, the dogmatic self imitates divine kenosis, which symbolizes the opposite way around, the evacuation of the divine and infinite for the sake of human finitude and service. Ironically enough, God wishes to become human, while humans are constantly engaged in efforts to place themselves as gods. In fact, kenosis, the point of departure for this theo-psychoanalysis as the evacuation of infinity, turns out to be the religious reverse of the romantic irony or Hegelian consciousness, which replace finite selfhood by the absolute ego. Acts of irony which reveal themselves as ultimate sins. The self thus sacrifices its illusions about divine infinity in order to reconcile itself with its finitude, weakness, and sinful nature, and in order to find its new determination in a service for the other, as this is prefigured in divine kenosis. The rediscovery and acceptance of this nature of weakness can only be translated in a new relation to this other, who, like the self, is in need for the other. And together only they can open themselves for a therapeutic dimension of freedom of the self. This therapeutic form of an incorporation of truth in life finds its ultimate expression in critical empathy, patience, attention, and consolation, in works of love, which the New Testament itself actually defines as an aletheuein, a doing of truth, which might be the best religious translation of Socratic parrhesia. I come to the end. Both the secular and the dogmatic ways of life are measures here through the ethical principle of this accordance, since both are not accomplished in life, but an ongoing effort to give up to this accordance, or to live up to this accordance. In this sense, they are always already related to each other as legitimate ways of life, in need of the other, who might be able to enlighten us about our own truth. Secular freedom and dogmatics are thus conceived of as competing ways which depend on, complete, examine, and criticize each other, without that the one can superimpose his way of life on the other, and without that one could be able to construct their relation in a system of truth. They are two ways of freedom, potentially in conflict and dissent, still waiting for their realization, as they are, of course, open to failure too. Kierkegaard has insisted against the system of truth and against any systematic integration and superimposition of the other on a model of enlightenment that he admired and adopted from Lessing's situational and ironical practice of communication. As Lessing's argument with the Orthodox pastor Goetze from Hamburg is led by his conviction that they are both engaged in a life for truth which cannot be decided by one or the other, nor can it be resolved in a higher truth, harmonizing the two positions. So Kierkegaard did not only oppose to any higher system of truth by suggesting an existential way of life based on dogmatics, but his strategy would have to unfold in a dialogue between two ways of freedom and truth, the secular and the dogmatic. In his additional remarks on the philosophical fragments, the additional remarks are 600 pages to the original text is just 100, Kierkegaard has dedicated a long chapter on the problem of subjectivity, culminating in a reading of Lessing. And here he quotes a longer passage from Lessing's On Truth. If God had closed in his right hand all truth, and in his left hand the drive always awake to strive for truth, although this drive in addition includes the possibility of constant error, and he would say to me, choose, I would fall with all humility on my knees and ask for the left. Please, Father, give me the left. The pure truth can be only yours. And Kierkegaard reminds the reader of the concept of this remark. These words can be found in a short essay from 1778 caused by the defense of resurrections written by religious men against Lessing's attack against dogmatic belief. Lessing is pleading then for a new enlightened way of freedom beyond the orthodox dogma of religion, and for this purpose he is attacking orthodox theology. But he is aware of the fact that orthodox belief cannot be refuted in its own claim to truth, and that both the secular and the dogmatic position are two competing ways of an incorporation, or should one say, incarnation of truth in life. When Kierkegaard is turning this game upside down by adopting the orthodox position he still clings to the same enlightened form of an open dialogue, however polemical and critical, developed by Lessing. Where Lessing chooses an open truth which is in constant danger of error, Kierkegaard proposes the path of a dogmatic life, always aware of the sinfulness of human nature. Where Lessing has opened the dialogue between enlightened secular culture and orthodox religion from the secular side, Kierkegaard has given the appropriate response from the orthodox perspective, reaffirming the free conditions of this dialogue. Thank you.
Well, we have a few minutes for a discussion, so you're all invited to discuss. Give them a minute to collect their thoughts. Yes, Michael. Professor Hegel.
Thank you very much. One issue that you mentioned in passing but didn't quite develop, and I wondered if you can elaborate on it more, is not just the concept of freedom, but the concept of autonomy. because after all, this is at the root of the Enlightenment program, and I wonder whether around this concept a dialogue can be maintained, and I think this issue or this question has the most relevant political implications for today, namely the, as you said, post-secular society is more skeptical and much more perhaps open to the possibilities of a dialogue, but and the notion of freedom can be discussed along these lines. But I wonder whether autonomy and the contradicting interpretations of autonomy can be somehow negotiated.
Well, if we are already referring to the post-secular concept as developed by Habermas and Ratzinger in 2004, it becomes very clear that Habermas is clinging, in fact, to the discourse of the autonomous subjectivity. But he is aware of the fact that this autonomous subjectivity cannot superimpose its rational ways of understanding to the religious way of life. Okay, so the whole project is, in fact, it's a kind of critique of pure secular reason. It is in favor of autonomous subjectivity, but it is afraid of the fact that through a purely strict and conceptual definition of this autonomous reason, it is in danger to oversee other possibilities of engaging in freedom. And that is the reason that he says, it's a strange thing, maybe it's a contradiction, but he says, although we cannot accept the conditions of truth that a religious person is coming from, we should be aware of the positive effects of his concept of truth, namely for the foundation of a more firm solidarity in society. So it is a kind of self-critique of the autonomous subject, being aware of the fact that there might be other possibilities of engaging in a life of freedom.
But on that basis, I mean, still this argument, if I understand correctly, I am by no means an expert neither on Habermas nor on Ratzinger, but the secular conception of autonomy can be enlarged along these lines indeed. That is, we recognize the autonomy of other subjects, of other people who set limits to that autonomy, but from our autonomous perspective, they should be given legitimacy. Yeah. I wonder whether in the other way around it's possible.
Okay, I missed that point. Well, of course, the whole discussion is only possible if you have on the other side a church or a synagogue which would accept this basic concept of freedom. Otherwise, it wouldn't work. So there is a certain first condition for this. No. I mean, this. Okay, then I misunderstood you. The problem is not from the autonomous side. The problem is from the religious side. Yeah. But the whole thing about this debate, of course, and here we have a paradox. The church was there in 1962. I mean, Habermas came at 2001. He recognized the positive potentials of that kind of offer from the church. Since the church then said that here we accept the fully legitimacy of secular pluralistic society. Okay? So here, that is the condition of possibility for that kind of dialogue, and I think that what we have, and that was my suggestion here, I mean, these are very, in a sense, preliminary efforts to formulate this thing. I think that if one reads Kierkegaard, and I think one can read him as somebody who was very much aware of that possibility. To read the two of them from the perspective of freedom and then engage dogmatics in a new way. That would be not just to say the church or the dogmatics are in the formal or pragmatic acceptance of a modern secular society. It would mean that this is a constitutive idea for reformulating or formulating dogmatics again from a new perspective. Okay, and I think this is a possible reading of Kierkegaard, and if one reads Kierkegaard, he gives some interesting proofs by looking at Lessing as his model for enlightenment. Okay, so if you want, you have a kind of secret history of another enlightenment beyond delegitimization, and it would lead from Lessing to Kierkegaard to this post-secular debate. If you want a sort of historiography of that.
Anyone else? Yes.
There's many dimensions to your paper, but one of the things that was interesting to me, among many other things, was the flight from finitude that you were talking. I say many interesting things, but could you say a little bit more about the flight from finitude, the evacuation of infinity that you were talking about there?
Well, it would fit, I think, in your what I think in your sort of own philosophical frame when you speak of decreation.
Right, yeah.
I mean, creation is, the funny thing about all a radical anti-theological picture is that it always speaks in the name of creation, but in fact, it is a way of decreation, because there's nothing more frightening than to be really created, that there's some instance before I can be myself. So I'm busy constantly to get away from this moment of creation, of finitude, of death, of weakness, and so on and so on. So that is a reading of Kierkegaard. I think that is his point of view. It's difficult for us to live up to finitude, and what we do is usually we try to create alternative forms of selves. But the funny thing is that while we're doing that kind of thing, God is doing precisely the opposite. We want to be God, and God is ready to be human for ourselves, and by this indicating two things: that our way, the positive way of living would be to accept finitude, but this is, of course, and remains very difficult. But the other is that maybe only God is in a position to really be able to live life in finitude.
Yeah.
You could say that Christ, in Kierkegaard's thought, is the only real existentialist who is able to cope in finitude, that kind of thing.
Well, I was just kind of wondering what you would say to those who would say finite and nothing but finite, finitude and nothing but finite, in such a manner that nothing other than the finite is raised at all. I mean, there are currents, certainly in Western European society, where even to raise the question of anything other is already it's just simply dismissed. You know, we are happy and contented with a sheerly asserted finitude as such, and even to raise the possibility that finitude evokes deep perplexities, it's not even allowed, because then these perplexities open. Okay. You see what I mean? I think that's a space in certain circles of secular intellectuals, where what one takes in the longer tradition to be the natural questions that come up in relation to finitude are themselves delegitimized in the manner that you were talking about at the beginning of it.
That would be the kind of next stage, that beyond the Kierkegaardian horizon, he still was convinced that we are afraid from that. I mean, he didn't really envisage the possibility that we might only wish to live in finitude, although, I mean, his concept of the aesthetical subject is, in a sense, I think, is that kind of subject who wants to engage in a life only of finitude, and not only in the analysis from the outside, but in if that's the analysis of Kierkegaard of this way of life, I think, is that it would be a long analysis, but it could only end up in a kind of total despair, whatever now the precise analysis of that despair would be. But here's then always the question: is this despair due to my objective analysis of it, or is it really the despair of the person who lives only in its finite time? So here is a kind of aporia open for the Kierkegaardian analysis, I think.
Thank you.
Yes.
No, yeah. So in regard to this final dialogue, I want to agree with Christoph that the aesthetic is exactly Kierkegaard's image to people who wants only to live in finitude. And in either or, there is the interesting letter of the ethical person tries to convince the aesthetic that his life should be that he should adopt a higher form of living. And he does this exactly by trying to evoke despair in this person, not by any dogmatic or philosophical means, trying to convince this person that his life is in some
must be despair.
Must be despair, but of course it depends only on the individual himself to despair or not to despair. So I totally agree with the Christoph answer, but this maybe also can relate us to Kierkegaard's affinity with Lessing. I mean, the affinity, I think, is based mainly on the stress on individuality, also on religiosity as an individual question. Mm-hmm. In regard to this affinity, I think there is an interesting question to ask, and this is the question of a dialogue. How dialogue between individuals now, I'm not talking about dialogue between secular institutions and religious, but the dialogue is a real difficult question, because while Kierkegaard also tried to stress the importance of the dialogue between individuals, he also says, like Lessing did before him, that in some way there is an impossibility of a dialogue. In one aspect of religiosity, there is no dialogue. So maybe you can refer to this question.
Well, there are very many ways of dialogue, and if one really takes Kierkegaard from his most radical positions, there is even not a verbal communication is not really possible, because I cannot teach anybody to another person if I really respect his freedom. So I have to engage in very complicated actions in order to bring him to the very... I mean, it's related to your first point. How can I convince somebody that he is, in fact, in despair? How do I do this? I mean, he, of course, would say, I'm not. I'm perfectly happy. So how do I do this? And then I have to engage in very complicated ways of communication, with the very important presupposition that I respect the very freedom of that person, and I want to convey my understanding that he is in despair. That makes the communication very possible. I think it has different layers. Part of this, one of the first would be just an open, clear, critical speech, which might have effects or might not have effects, but it would mean that in certain situations, if you think now about Kierkegaard as the religious subject, he would pronounce his dogmatic belief, and that's what I believe. And he would say that in a context where this belief is not necessarily accepted by other people, in order to engage in a discourse with this dogmatic belief, in order to show, for instance, certain contradictions and problems with the way that a secular way of life of freedom is being held. Okay, but it is a very complicated question. Maybe it is the complicated question to anybody who has a kind of view of therapy of others, still respecting their freedom. Okay, and I think Kierkegaard, in this sense, is a master of thinking this problem. Well, that's what I just can produce for this occasion. Yeah.
Good. If there are no further questions, it remains for me to thank both Christoph. I think we had a marvelous first session. I wish you all a happy break. Please remember to come back.